Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am here with the author of a fantastic debut novel that I was just saying consumed my entire previous weekend, and I am so excited to dig into it. Could I please ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, my name's Raul Palma, and I'm the author of A Haunting in Hialeah Gardens, which is coming out through Dudden on October 3rd.
This is such a fantastic book. I love all of the different genres it plays with. I love the main character and his complexity, and I love things that happen later in the book that I don't want to spoil for people. But before before we get into all that, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your journey to this book. How did you get into writing? I know that you are a professor of writing at Ithaca, if I read correctly. So I'm wondering, like, how did this novel arise?
And actually, I'll respond to the first part of that question really quick. How I got into writing. It's a funny story. I started writing, really passionate about writing in kindergarten, because my teacher at the time took me to the library, and we sat around and we listened to a story from my librarian. And I remember at the time I actually wasn't paying attention at all. I was playing with something in the carpet, and when we got back to class, we had to draw something that we recalled from the story. And because I hadn't paid attention, I just kind of made something up. And then made this whole story about this image that I created. And the teacher gave me the grace of saying, you know what? That sounds wonderful, right? So that I felt there was some power to that. There was some excitement. And I've carried that love for writing ever since, just what the power of fiction offers. With A Haunting in Hialeah Gardens, it began when I was studying at the University of Nebraska. I just moved there. I'm from Miami originally. So it was quite a shift. Center of the country, out in the Great Plains, and, adjusting to a life as a grad student, small stipend, and I remember it was winter, and I looked out my window and I was like, where am I? How did I get here? And feeling debt, right? The pressure of student loan debt. I had some exams that I needed to study for, and rather than doing that, I was like, I want to write about what I'm feeling right now. And that's kind of how Hugo was born. It started there as a short story, and then eventually over time, really kind of listening to not just Hugo, but playing with these themes around that, saw that there was an opportunity to expand into a novel. So years later, I came back to it.
That's fantastic. First, on your writerly origin story, that's great. And I think, there is like a moment for people when they realize, I think, that they have the ability to make things up that entertain other people. That's really powerful for a lot of people. And I love the role that libraries play too, as I think I've thought about for a long time about how libraries help to make readers, but it's only recently, I think, that I've thought about how they also help to make writers too. So that's really cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you mentioned Hugo and the role that debt plays in this novel, because I also I am laboring under a whole bunch of student loan debt, and the descriptions of just how it kind of like lives with you all the time and is always sort of like taking up a little bit of your like active thinking space felt so realistic. And so could you talk a little bit about Hugo and his situation, and maybe how that like guides his choices at the beginning of the novel?
Oh, sure. Yeah, the what I'm fascinated by is like you said, right? It plays such a large part in our lives, and we think about that in very particular ways right now. I think student loan debt, medical bills, and it's this invisible pressure that we often feel, but seldom in my own circles do we sit around and talk about it. And so in the novel, I wanted the debt to be abrasively visible, in Hugo's face, literally cuddling up with him in bed in the opening paragraph, because I wanted to make visible what's often just kind of in the background, in a way. And for Hugo, his experience with debt is very negative. You know, he owes money to various creditors, and then there's a collection firm in particular that is garnishing his wages, and he comes to understand what it means to owe somebody something, what it means to owe a community something. These sorts of questions, he comes to understand it in a very transactional way, where he's kind of always under the heel to some degree. So part of what the novel is exploring is there a way to absolutely acknowledge the negative debt in that negative category, but is there also a way to acknowledge the ways in which that it can be beautiful on very fundamental terms to owe something to somebody? And I joke to some degree with my daughter is 10 years old, and if I were keeping a tally on everything she owes me, right, she'd be in debt for life. Right? And the beauty there is that, of course, none of this is meant to be reconciled or captured on a receipt or any of that, right? It's simply built into the love and nature of our relationships, the fact that we do owe each other things.
Wow.
The novel's playing with those ideas a little, and I see Hugo as kind of caught in the middle of that. They're in a kind of bleak situation.
Yeah. Wow, that is so interesting. And I really, I don't think I was thinking of like debt as a sort of like in and of itself, like a neutral thing, that can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on the context. And that is really lovely. And it makes me think too about the ways that like the bad kinds of debt, like the medical debt, the money he owes to various creditors, can often like impede us from being able to focus on or really commit to like the debt that we have to our family members, our loved ones, and stuff like that. Like it really can get in the way of our human relations too. Could you talk a little bit about, how this like maybe shapes his worldview and his relationship with who I guess I would term like, is Alexei the antagonist? I'm not sure, but his antagonist, right, in this situation for sure. So yeah, could you talk a little bit about what's going on there?
Absolutely. For Hugo, his Miami, right, such a vibrant city, really this rising global city, beautiful location for commerce, for migration, you name it, right? You've got people who go for Art Basel, right, to go to Wynwood and see amazing art, and more recently with soccer, right, with Messi and all the excitement there. For Hugo, what's interesting, I think, with Hugo is that although he lives in Miami, right, his world is kind of shrunk, almost claustrophobic. His debts have made him vulnerable to the degree that he almost doesn't want to be in a situation where he needs to initiate a transaction, right, which leaves him in this tiny little efficiency most of the time, or going to work, and as opposed to Alexei, right, who's having a very different experience. Alexei is the one who is largely seen as the debt collector, the creditor, and we might say, his living quarters are large, right, spacious. So right there's a striking difference just in the way that they experience life in Miami. And part of the journey in this novel is seeing if there's a way to broaden Hugo's life to affirm his experiences in Miami beyond his regular go-to. So there are little moments in the novel where maybe he goes to a restaurant unexpectedly, right? Or maybe he's in traffic, stuck in traffic, but in the ugliness of that, of moments of road rage, right? He affirms his life in certain ways. And I guess what I'm getting at is there are ways in which these systems of debt have captured Hugo and have occupied every space of his life. And I think he's squeezed to the point where he's just trying to find space to live and be himself, and in a weird turn of events, it's his interactions between Alexei that allow some of this to begin to come up, even if they're at each other's throats,
Yeah. It's a really interesting dynamic, and I love sort of the way that Hugo leverages his job, you know, and how he performs it with Alexi. Because I think have failed to mention that so far, that Hugo works at a botanica and is you know, is employed by Alexi to sort of like clear the haunting and that he's experiencing out of his house. And so can you talk a little bit about that role? Because there's so many things going on, like when Hugo comes in and does his like spiritual work in a space, because he's like doing the work of a spiritualist, but also kind of like of a therapist sometimes a little bit. And like there's a little bit of con artistry to it too. So could you talk a little bit about that aspect as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Growing up in Miami, it was part of my daily life to see evidence, let's say, of what I guess my parents would describe as santeria, or you know, these kind of rituals, right, that are steeped in Yoruba traditions, where you might see evidence of it on a walk to school, or if you go to a friend's house who is Catholic and has saints, you know, there by the doorway, things like that. And so for Hugo, you know, as somebody who's employed at a botanica, and it's this strange relationship, right? Because the botanica at once is supposed to be this site of magic, right? Of the site of the sacred and holy, but the transactional nature of a botanica undermines that. You know, like when you pay for a candle that's supposed to give you good fortune, right? Does the transaction allow that magic to occur, right? Or is it somehow already captured in the system? So what immediately in the novel, I try to differentiate between what Hugo does and what Lourdes does, who's his boss and the owner of the botanica, where Lourdes seems to have Hugo there so that he could handle the dirty side of the business, collect the money. You know, she doesn't really touch it. Lourdes is more concerned, right, with the integrity of the botanica itself. So from the very start, Hugo feels a bit detached from that spiritually, and sees it, has lost his ability to see the magic in the world, right? Everything is just very logical. You know, there is no ghost, there is no spirit. And part of the fun there was you know, as a writer, especially telling Hugo, you know, your worldview is not that simple, right? It's actually a lot more expansive, and you're about to find out.
Yeah, like while you were talking, I was really thinking that the novel depicts like Miami is sort of like as several cities kind of layered over each other, because there's like poor Miami and there's rich Miami. There is like sacred Miami and there's like everyday sort of banal Miami under it. And they all coexist in like really interesting ways. I would love if you could talk a little bit about the aspects of Hugo's past and how sort of like the let's say like the trauma of colonialism sort of affects his past in his home country, but also how like the legacy plays out like in Miami and the various places that he's been in America. So yeah, could you talk about that aspect of the book a little bit?
Oh yeah. The Hugo, it's funny because, you know, his past, once he begins to delve into it, or once the novel begins to delve into it, it's expensive, right? There's a whole life there, right? A whole world. And to some degrees, right, a city like Miami, of course, also has a really complicated past and history. And if you're just kind of visiting Miami, maybe as a tourist, or even just kind of going through the motions of life, getting a little coffee or something, right? Sometimes I guess we're not always excavating that past, or seeing how that past, you know, is informing where we're at the moment. So with going into this novel, I actually, in drafting it, began with Hugo's story. And in particular, what drove me there was this idea, the silver mines. I guess I drew an association between debt collection practices, which somebody might describe as you know, mining debt, right? Or mountains of debt, you know, collect. And I drew an association between contemporary practices and then these kind of colonial violent acts, right? In particular in Bolivia, or in Potosi, where the entire mountain was mined under really terrible conditions, and the kind of ecological and environmental damage persists today, and political, social, you name it, there's still children working those mines, right? And then it was interesting to me that essentially the Industrial Revolution was funded largely by silver from those mines, right? And there's still kind of this gaping wound literally in the land itself. So that this kind of glimmer of an image between this mountain that had just kind of been exhausted, and then like this thriving Miami came into view. So I that's what drove me to Hugo in particular. And then I guess part of the story is how important it is to excavate our histories, our pasts, and to understand where we're at in the context of where we've been. Which I would say in a city like Miami, sometimes it's a fast-moving city, right? And sometimes that doesn't always happen. So I felt particularly important as a project.
I'm so glad you used that word excavate, because I feel like it's sort of what Hugo is doing throughout the novel in so many different ways. Yeah, because there's the literal literal excavation, but also like he is constantly like revisiting the relationships in his life, like past and present, and sort of reevaluating them and thinking of them in new ways. One of the most moving, I think, parts of the novel is sort of the way he revisits his marriage. And how, I don't want to say his view of the relationship and of his wife change over time, but it becomes more nuanced, I think, and sort of like you can see him processing like loss and like a relationship dynamic in real time. And you see that happening too with his sort of relationship with the man who helped him cross into the country and who sort of like looked over him in his childhood. He is reevaluating all these different things. And yeah, I'm like wondering like if the ways in which like his inner turmoil is so like richly expressed in sort of like the supernatural things, without spoiling too many of them, like thinking about that sort of like the inner turmoil and how that like gets expressed in the sort of outer things happening. I hope that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely. One just to go on a really brief tangent. A novel that I love, even though it's super long and kind of, people make fun of it because it's Victor Hugo's Les Mis, right? Make fun of it because it goes into the details about the Parisian sewers and, all of that. But one of my favorite scenes in that novel, I'll never forget, it's the moment that Jean Valjean leaves the bishop's house. And he's supposed to become a better man because the bishop forgave him for stealing, right? And said, oh, the things you stole are actually yours. So he's supposed to become this better man. And in the musical and the films, he becomes a better man. And of course, in the novel, he doesn't. In the novel, he leaves the bishop's house and he comes across a young boy out in the countryside in which there's no city in view. And the young boy is flipping a coin and he catches the coin. And the young boy is like, hey, give me my coin back. And he says, what coin? Right. And he steals this coin from this boy. And the boy runs away crying. And it's only afterward that he feels really guilty about what he's done. But what I'm getting at is there's this moment where Jean Valjean looks out and tries to think, where is the boy? How can I redeem myself? And there's no city in sight, and he spends pages going from one city to another looking for him. And the possibility of redemption or forgiveness or you name it becomes completely impossible, right? It kind of gets absorbed into the landscape. And with Hugo, particularly with some of what's happening with Melly, with his wife, I was exploring something similar, right? It would be so easy for Hugo to be able to maybe kind of consolidate his feelings into one particular event or transaction or exchange between them. But the novel really denies that, and I think that maybe contributes a little bit to the psychological horror there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, because I'm thinking too about how sort of I'm wondering like if what's going on with like the relationship and with the debt and all that is like how we are forced to like compartmentalize these things in order to keep living our daily life. And so what we're actually seeing is him like kind of reintegrating all these things that he's been trying to keep shut out. Yeah, I really appreciated Hugo's characterization and that like is like he doesn't do the right thing all the time. You know, he's shaped by his past trauma and sort of by this like a lot of armor, you know, emotional and protective armor, you know, that he's built up a lot around himself. And I think that it's like it makes the novel so much more resonant that like he is like, you know, Jean Valjean in a few ways, is that like it takes a little bit of time for this to happen, you know, and that felt really real and really moving.
Thank you.
Welcome. Yeah, I had one more question that's sort of about writing and craft and stuff like that. Because you do have a volume of short stories that preceded this in the world of ultraviolet light. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it's like to move from writing short stories to writing a full-length novel. Does one come easier to you than the other, or was this a particular challenge or an exciting new opportunity, or like how was that transition?
That's a great question. It's funny. My writing process, you know, it begins with finding time to write. And what is it? And competing interests, right? Sometimes, especially before these books came out, I'd be writing, and my wife would be in the other room, you know, taking care of our daughter, and I'd be like, I feel so guilty. You know, I should go help. And she's so supportive. I began. I mentioned that because in particularly when I was doing my PhD, I was more drawn to short stories because with a short story, and it's not true for every writer, but I could get in a day and draft an entire short story, right? And I could walk away from it and be like, that was hard, but I arrived at the end, and now I can return to this and revise it, and you know, I feel accomplished, you know. But with a novel, it would be so painful, right? To just, I'm going to sit down one day and just do the whole thing. I know folks have done it, but it's so painful. It's so expansive, you know, and you can get lost in them, right? Earlier novels that I've written that, you know, haven't seen the light of day, I did get lost in them for years, right? Just kind of trying to find my way through. I think what I appreciate about the short story is, you know, you could kind of see it, right? You can play with structure and plot in ways that are, you know, that you can visualize and appreciate, and that helped, I think, with writing Hunting in Hialeah Gardens a bit. But I guess the long and short of it is, like, I kind of move in between them. Sometimes I'll be working on a story, and I'll finish it, and I'll be like, this is great as a story, and then I'll think maybe I should return to this and expand it right into a novella or something like that. The Hunting in Hialeah Gardens began as a short story, and it felt so rushed that I was like, I really need to draw this out and give it the time it needs. You know, so they move between each other a bit, and I think of the novel as an opportunity to really delve much deeper into the larger undercurrents, themes, in ways that maybe a short story will offer a glimmer of, you know.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I've always thought like short stories must be so hard because you have to be so ruthlessly you know, economical. And you really have to be very sparse with your storytelling. And I'm very interested in how those things, even how things move from short stories to novels. Like that's very cool to me. What is next for you? Do you have more short stories or another novel on the horizon, or what's going on right now?
I am working on something. It's I don't have a title yet. I'm looking at you know, I write a lot about Miami, and a lot of my research is in that area too. And Miami, of course, you know, major tourist site. Even if we look back to its early history, right? You've got Henry Flagler, who's convinced to come down because even though North Florida is freezing, Miami's still warm. Right? And you've always got this idea of like, come down to South Florida, right? Where you could be on the beach and forget you have a job, you know, those kinds of things, right? So I'm imagining, you know, a kind of dystopic I think it's in the air. A lot of people are trying to imagine what's Miami going to look like 100 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm playing with that idea, and in particular, a kind of Chernobyl-like nuclear meltdown that occurs in proximity to Miami. And the novel opens with an expedition. There's a vessel that's going to a largely uninhabited Miami that's being funded by tourism. And it's a scientist and a documentary maker who are trying to make sense of what happened 100 years prior. And the scientist is going to collect mosquito samples. The documentary writer is looking for evidence. And it's really about their competing ways of thinking and their different epistemologies, the way they conflict, I think in conversation with kind of our post-truth moment. And also in conversation with novels like Frankenstein and Annihilation, right? The idea being that, even when Miami no longer exists, right, what would it take for it to rise up again, right, in the imaginary, or to take a new form, something like that. It's kind of rough early stages, but messing around, getting in there.
Well, that sounds fantastic. I'm very excited to see where that goes. And, even though it's early days, like, you are welcome back to the show to come talk about that book when it's out, because it sounds fantastic. So thank you for talking to us and for this book. This has been wonderful.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. All right, listeners, please pick up A Haunting in Hialeah Gardens. By the time that you hear this, it will be available. So head over to your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go get your books. Thank you so much. It is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.